Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. So happy to have you with us this morning. We're broadcasting on Channel 9. We're also streaming on Port Media's YouTube channel. And if you prefer to watch that way, it's easy to find. Go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon. We're also broadcasting on WJOP-LP Newburyport, FM 96.3 this morning. I'm Mary Jacobsen, your host, and I've been excited about this show ever since I first learned that the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem was hosting an exhibit on the Salem Witch Trials 1692. So this morning we have one of the co-curators, Dan Lipcan, is here to talk about it. And then toward the end of the show, I'm delighted to be welcoming a board member from the Salem-based nonprofit Voices Against Injustice. Patricia Fay-Ho will be here to talk about that organization's mission to make sure that the lessons learned from the Salem witch trials never disappear. So let me introduce you first then to Dan Lipcan. He's the head librarian of the Phillips Library at the Peabody Essex Museum, and he's the co-curator of the Salem Witch Trials 1692 exhibit. He's also one of the curators of the forthcoming exhibit, My Dear Davy and Chester, that will be opening at Peabody Essex in late November. He's been at Peabody Essex since 2019. Prior to that, he spent 16 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Thomas J. Watson Library, where he led their library systems. Dan has a BA in studio art with a specialty in printmaking from Allegheny College and a master's in library science from Queens College, CUNY. So Dan, welcome, and thank you so much for visiting us here at the morning show to talk about this exhibit.
Thanks, Mary. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk about the exhibition.
It's my pleasure. Well, first off, Dan, I was hoping that you could just tell us something about the exhibit itself. What types of documents or materials are on display? And also, why did Peabody Essex decide to launch this exhibit right now?
Sure. So the Salem Witch Trials 1692 exhibition includes 19 objects, 8 books, and 20 original manuscripts from the trial proceedings. So the exhibition, we tell the real story of the crisis through the documents related to and the objects once in the possession of key figures that were involved in the trials. Our collections are so deep and rich that everything on view is owned or stewarded by us. And it's a really special thing that we can show an object that was once owned by a victim and put it next to a transcript of the examination of that person that mentions that very object. So it's a really exciting thing for us to be able to do. Regarding why now, we mounted this exhibition at the urging of our new director, Brian Kennedy, who started a month after I did in July of 2019. But it's also in line with the general pivot that we've been making towards our local community and our local history. And I think it's particularly interesting that 2020 has been a really great year to address the themes of injustice and prejudice that were so prevalent in 1692, because these issues are on the minds of many of us today, and it really is remarkable how many parallels can be drawn between the conditions that set the stage for the 1692 crisis and those that we're experiencing now here in 2020.
Yes, and I'm sure that we'll get into that more during the course of the interview, but it feels like a rare privilege to be able to have access to the original witch trial documents. And these are rarely exhibited, I understand, because of the need to preserve and keep them in good condition. Is that accurate, Dan?
That's accurate. I mean, these documents are over 300 years old. They are very fragile. They're very light sensitive. And that's probably one of the main reasons, is because they are so light sensitive. So we can really only have them out for a limited period of time.
So this is a rare opportunity, folks, to go see these actual documents. Dan, every year, thousands of people visit Salem, especially in October, I suppose, to learn about the witch trials, which did happen, as you just pointed out, more than 300 years ago. So what do you think makes the Salem witch trials timelessly fascinating and compelling for people?
Well, I think it's due to many factors, in the same way that there were multiple reasons for the outbreak of the crisis, right? So it came at a time when America was, in a sense, being birthed. It was this transition between the Puritan community and the independence, this Yankee independence that we see in early New England. It's a classic story of persecution and injustice. It has elements of the macabre and the occult, witchcraft. There's this air of mystery about it, I think, because some of the facts and the events are and always will remain completely unknowable to us. And so there's this unknown element that is fascinating. It's a classic human tragedy, and it's also been reinforced in popular culture. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, the TV series Bewitched is filmed some of their episodes in Salem. And of course, everybody knows the 1990s Disney movie Hocus Pocus. So you take all of these things and it adds up to this fascination. And, in some ways you can take, and we've seen this in the scholarship, that there are many different angles that you can take on the reasons for and the issues involved with the witch trials. And so, we can identify with the characters in the story in a whole variety of ways.
Well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it has all the elements of things that fascinate us since Greek tragedy through Shakespearean tragedy and ancient history to modern history. Small wonder. Well, I was hoping, Dan, can you give us a sense of the scale of the witch trials? How many people were involved in the accusing? How many people were accused? How many actually were executed, and how?
So the crisis was actually, the scale of it was extremely widespread for the time. There were over 200 people that were accused, and they lived as far west as Billerica, Massachusetts, and as far north as Wells, Maine. George Burroughs, who was a reverend who was eventually executed, was the former minister of Salem Village, and he lived up in Maine.
I did not realize it had a geographic reach that far. That's really interesting.
It is. And, the center of the crisis, though, was obviously Salem Village, which is now Danvers. Salem and over in Topsfield were also locations that had quite a bit of activity. And dozens of people accused others of witchcraft. But I should also add that dozens of others had the courage to stand up for those who had been accused and submitted petitions to the court on their behalf. So there were also people that tried to defend people who had been accused.
And I think those stories are perhaps less well known. The people who actually stood up, but I'm heartened to hear that, and I'm all the more curious to go to the exhibit and learn more about some of those stories.
And I think, and to kind of finish the answer to your question there. So 25 people died as a result of the crisis. Right. So 19 were executed by hanging. One person, Giles Corey, was pressed to death because he refused to enter a plea. And that was because the court was adhering to English law. That was the torture that was required to get somebody to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. But he ended up staying silent and died because of it. It's the only pressing to death in Massachusetts history. And 5 people died in prison, including the infant daughter of the accused witch, Sarah. So it's really a terrible tragedy.
Yes.
And those deaths happened between May of 1692 and March of 1693.
Yeah. Wow. Your description of the deaths really brings home the violence of what went on and the tragic loss of what, of course, we now know today were all completely innocent lives. Well, Dan, I know that there have been a number of speculative theories about, what was it that turned Salem into a haven for witch hunting. I was hoping that you could describe for us some of the past explanations that have now been discredited.
Well, we actually address a few of these in the introductory panel to the exhibition that's in the atrium of PEM, because it really is important for us to clarify a few of the things that seem to be prevalent that were actually not factors in the outbreak. So a few of those, one is that a bunch of people ate rotten bread and were hallucinating because of, we're experiencing hallucinations as a result.
Like psychedelic spores or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Not a cause.
Not true, huh?
Not a cause.
Okay.
Ergot poisoning is another reason that is floated. Same thing, hallucinations also.
What is ergot?
It's some, I actually don't know.
Oh, okay.
But
I feel better about not knowing that.
I just,
it wasn't part of it anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Well, luckily we had the guidance and advice of two of the real top experts on the witch trials, Emerson Baker from Salem State and Richard Trask, who's the Danvers town archivist, who kind of is the godfather of witch trial scholarship. And, it's interesting because they, we had this great fortune to work with them, and they've been battling these myths for a long time now, and they don't seem to go away. Another one is this outbreak of encephalitis, which is not true. There had been an outbreak of smallpox in Boston in 1690, and it still had not kind of run its course by 1692. So that actually was a factor, but not encephalitis and not hallucinations.
Okay. So those factors were perhaps an effort to find some kind of physiological explanation for what now seems like bizarre and dangerous behavior. And they've been discredited, which leaves us looking at religious, economic, and political explanations. And that was the next thing that I wanted to ask you about. What were some of the religious, economic, and or political conditions at the time that contributed to rising anxieties and fears, which manifested then in a hunt for witches? And not for nothing then, Dan, why witches in particular? What particular harm did witches represent that people thought they were endangered by?
Well, I think, there, of course, are a variety of factors, as I've said, that set the stage for the trials. And I'll just add to the last question that there is some talk and some recent scholarship on the possibility that some of the afflicted were experiencing symptoms of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Interesting.
Because one of the reasons for one of the conditions was this war on the northern border in Maine and New Hampshire of the settlers against the indigenous populations and the French. And there were refugees coming south from that border to escape the conflicts along the frontier. So it has been a theory that PTSD was a factor.
I had not heard that theory, but that makes sense, because being triggered is the verb that people use now, by something that a kind of anxiety that would remind you of the trauma that you experienced. That makes more sense to me than some of the other discredited explanations. So there had been a war going on, and there were some refugees from that war. And then were the people in Salem Village also impacted by the war? Were there fears of invasion ongoing at the time?
Well, I think there was a general sense of unease, and the border is really not far from Danvers. So as refugees were coming from the border, this was a real effect on households as people took in refugees that were coming down, and that contributed to the religious conflicts that were going on. Reverend Samuel Parris was a relatively new minister of Salem Village, and he was a controversial figure. There were conflicts between the more cosmopolitan folks in Salem town, the merchants, and those people that lived in the country. There had been extreme weather in the form of really dry and hot summers and very cold winters. And so all of these things kind of combined to set the stage for this crisis. And as far as witches are concerned, the belief in witchcraft was still prevalent in the Massachusetts Bay Colony because those beliefs had come over from Europe and England, and it does provide witchcraft, and the accusation of witchcraft provides a convenient outlet for scapegoating, right? So when things start to go wrong and times get to be challenging, perhaps you look for the reasons of the misfortune that you're having and someone to blame for it. And if your misfortune appears inexplicable, well, maybe it's because somebody you don't particularly like or agree with is perpetrating some form of supernatural punishment on you.
And I guess the underlying anxiety then takes the form of, projecting your fear and anxiety outward onto somebody you can scapegoat, with the hope then that if you can control it and manipulate and extinguish perhaps what you perceive to be the source, the externalized source of your threat, then you will somehow in this crazy way, believe that you can become safer then.
Right.
Yeah.
Well said, Mary. That was great.
Thank you, Dan. I was just summarizing what you said. But anyway, I was curious to find out, because these would have been primarily Puritans living in Salem Village. Was there something about the Puritan psyche or Puritan metaphysics or cosmology that made them prone to look for signs of diabolic intervention, or to be inclined to seek scapegoats to externalize their anxieties?
I mean, I'm not an expert on Puritans on the subject, but I think even just the name Puritans indicates to us that they were quite intolerant of, any deviation from their accepted practices and beliefs and norms. And so, these conditions were ripe for conflict and scapegoating. And the Puritans, I think, probably felt quite threatened by new modes of thinking and by other settlers with different beliefs that were moving into the colony, like Quakers. There was a Quaker community in Salem, and they didn't get along very well. Mm-hmm. So those are the kinds of things that were in play at the time. And, but I do think the rigidity of the Puritans, is a big factor there.
Mm-hmm. Of course, it's interesting to think about the Puritans having escaped religious persecution, one of the factors for their coming here. And then it seems, both ironic, but also in a way logical, having been persecuted. The part that doesn't make sense is that they would turn around and then persecute others. But on the other hand, it makes perfect sense when you figure that they have then, well, you mentioned trauma, that they have internalized that sense of persecution. And that might be an overlay then in their minds that they would have, that they imported with them, Dan. In fact, last week I had on the morning show, I had a professor of political science named Joseph Usinski. He's at the University of Miami, but he's a specialist in conspiracy theories. And since you were coming on the show, I said, Dan, Joe, I've got somebody coming on next week to talk about the Salem Witch Trials. It turns out he was from New Hampshire, and he'd been to Salem, and he was very familiar with the Salem Witch Trials. And he said that the Salem Witch Trials were a perfect example of the components of a conspiracy theory. And the thing that he said links conspiracy theorists together is that they have an underlying mindset to see conspiracies naturally, organically arising out of everything around them. So in a way, with the Puritans having experienced religious persecution, and it was real, in England, that it makes sense that could become a habit of mind that they also brought to Salem Village. So anyway, it's really interesting. But the part that I was curious to ask you about is that some people were more scapegoated than others. And the people most scapegoated were women. I mean, I understand from what I read about the exhibit that women, men, and children were among those who suffered and who died as a result of the witch trials. But it was primarily women, and for some reason, midwives in particular were targeted. And so I was hoping that perhaps you could say a little bit about why it was women in particular, and perhaps why midwives were especially targets for scapegoating.
Sure. I mean, there's a phrase that Emerson Baker uses that I really like, in that he likes to say that witchcraft is a gendered crime, right? So probably 75 to 80% of accused witches were women, most often older women, perhaps at the end of their childbearing years or older, and often single or childless. The tradition of targeting women has European origins, and the great witch hunting era that we saw in Europe between roughly 1500s to the mid 1700s was also quite focused on the prosecution of women, right? So they were seen as the weaker sex, and therefore more prone to the devil's temptations. And as far as midwives are concerned, they were particularly vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. They had intimate knowledge, no pun intended, of procreation, fertility,
Fair enough.
Delivery of babies, contraception, abortion, and the fact that they had access, the earliest possible access to newly born babies, meant that theoretically they were able to cause a great deal of harm and do a lot of damage.
Yeah, that makes sense because they had a kind of a power, which
That's
would
right.
have made them suspect, and also would have been a channel for certain kinds of anxieties then. Also, you were talking about women as the target. I mean, it goes back to Adam and Eve, doesn't it, Dan?
It does. It does.
Just more susceptible to temptation.
Right.
That apple.
Yeah, the apple. Yeah.
Well, I also saw a mention in the materials that I read through about the exhibit of the 15th century document. I hope I pronounced this correct. Correct me if I'm wrong. The Malleus Maleficarum, and the influence that it had on encouraging people to look for witches amongst their fellow citizens. Could you tell us about the impact what that document was and the impact that it had on people in Salem Village?
Sure. So it was originally published in 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum, by a German inquisitor, and his name was Heinrich Intolerance. He was very vigorously working to prosecute on quote unquote on behalf of the Catholic Church. And the book lays out proof for the quote unquote, again, quote unquote, proof for the existence of witches, describes how to identify them, and it details how you prosecute them. So because it was initially published when it was, this was the dawn of the printing era. And it was also essentially the dawn of the European witch hunting era, which coincided with the Counter-Reformation as a response to the Protestant Reformation of the early 1500s. So because of the birth of printing, we had dozens of editions published by probably 1520, and it became a really widespread book. And it was used to prosecute people in both church courts, but also in secular courts. And it really, truly became the premier manual for hunting and prosecuting witches.
Wow. So they had a manual.
It was a manual. That's
Okay.
right. It told you what to do when you encountered a
boy.
witch and how to prosecute it. So,
Oh my goodness. I can't help but think of the old Monty Python routine about how to tell if someone was a witch, that you put them on the water and if they float, they're guilty and you have to burn them. And if they sink and drown, they were innocent. So anyway.
And I think in that sketch, they weigh them against a duck, I think, right? Because
yes, I think so.
Is a duck.
Yes.
The duck floats. So if a witch is heavier than a duck.
Yeah. So it's disturbing to think they had their own manual. But anyway, but also kind of helps you understand that this was not a new idea in Salem Village by any means.
That's right.
So, well, I was hoping, Dan, that you could talk about a couple of the documents that I read are included in the exhibit and speak a little bit to their impact. One is, and it has kind of a chilling name, but it's the death warrant of Bridget Bishop. So who was Bridget Bishop, and can you share with us what her warrant says?
Sure. So we are the stewards of about 550 original documents, most of which are on deposit from the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court archives they were put on deposit with the Essex Institute back in 1980. The Phillips Library we own 31 original documents of our own. The rest belong to the state. And out of all of those documents, this Bridget Bishop death warrant is the only death warrant in our library. So it's a really special document. This was something that we closed the 1692 section of the exhibition with. She was the first to be put on trial. The Attorney General at the time, Thomas Newton, probably viewed her as an easy target. She had been accused and acquitted of witchcraft about a dozen years before, in about 1680, and she was known as a little bit quarrelsome and perhaps didn't have the best relationships around town. And so this document was written by the Chief Justice of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, William Stoughton. It was written on June 8th. And in it, he sentences Bridget Bishop to death for witchcraft and establishes that the date of execution will be 2 days from now, essentially. Wow. So there's an addendum, and then there's his wax seal is affixed there on the left that still exists. That's still that's on the document, which is really great. And then there's an addendum at the bottom of the document, and that's called an officer's return, basically a summary of what happened. And that's written in a different hand, and it's written by Sheriff George Corwin. And in that officer's return, he reports that he's done what has been requested of him by Stoughton. So I'll just read the quote from that
Yeah.
officer's return that
Yeah.
we actually pulled out and we put in larger type on the wall. So that says, in part, I have taken the body of the within named Bridget Bishop to the place provided for her execution and caused the said Bridget to be hanged by the neck until she was dead.
Oh, Dan, I mean, these original documents, these were the actual words in the document that completed the execution. It just, it's hard to find the words. It just really brings it home that these were, real people. So the other document that really struck me, and this is one that you read on the PEMcast, and everybody watch the PEMcast on the Peabody Exhibit Museum site about this exhibit. It's very extremely well done and very powerful. But I was hoping you would also share with us the similarly striking and moving petition of Mary Esty. Tell us a little bit about who she was, and I hope that you would be willing to read us the words of her petition.
Sure, glad to. And I have to say that my colleagues Dinah Carden and Chip Van Dyke did a really amazing job
They
with
did.
that PEMcast.
Yeah.
And yes, I'm featured on it, but that's, they somehow got a whole cast of all-stars, the mayor, Tina Jordan from the Witch Museum, Tad Baker, Emerson
Yes.
Baker to contribute to it. And it's a really fascinating and really nice summary.
It was all in 24 minutes.
Yeah,
Extremely well done.
Right. Very efficient and effective. So kudos to them. But Mary Esty was one of the town sisters from Topsfield. Her sisters were Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Cloyce. All three were accused and jailed, and Rebecca Nurse and Mary were executed. Somehow Sarah escaped and was released from prison in January 1693. But in any case, Mary wrote a couple of very moving petitions to the court in mid-September during the course of her trial. And the one that she authored on her own is perhaps the most heroic document that I know of in the entire universe of witchcraft trial papers. And so the quote that we've pulled out reads as follows: I petition to your honors not for my own life, for I know I must die and my appointed time is set. But if it be possible, no more innocent blood may be shed. So she's realizing what's happening to her. She knows this is inevitable, but somehow she's still able to summon the compassion and the strength to think of others and to advocate on their behalf.
Yeah.
Which I think is really, it's so admirable. I mean, the other parts of this petition include a request to the court to look harder at accusers and to really think critically about whether or not their testimony is truthful. Mm-hmm. So it's this tragically beautiful document and language. And I think we all maybe have something to learn from Mary.
It just, there's an authenticity to the words. It just pierces you through the heart right across 300 years.
Yeah.
And that brings me to something else I wanted to ask you about, Dan, because I've read that you said, maybe it was in the PIMcast, but I might have been in something else I read, that the exhibit, that you felt the heavy weight of history while examining some of these ancient yellow documents from the collection center. I wondered if you could explain to us what you meant by the weight of history and how you personally have been affected by reviewing these documents.
Sure. It's kind of hard to describe what this has been like, being able to go back to the stacks and take out and look at and handle what are truly priceless artifacts of our regions and our states and our country's history. And I'm really, really, truly blessed and grateful to be the position that I'm in. So that this weight, I feel, is this responsibility, first of all, to provide these documents with the best possible care and stewardship that we can to ensure that they're here 300 years from now, right?
Yeah.
That's extremely important, and that's part of why we're in business as a museum and library.
Yeah.
But secondly, we have a responsibility to look with clear eyes at these events and at these people, to tell the true and unadulterated story, to reflect back on what happened back then and to take lessons of this tragedy to heart and make sure that something like this never happens again. And that's part of that weight for me, is to communicate that story and these ideas.
Absolutely. Well, along those lines, I wanted to ask you also, eventually, of course, Salem would look back on the witch trials with clearer eyes and less hysterical reactions. How long did it take for that shift to happen, and what effect did it have on Salem to look back with clearer eyes and see the tragedy that they had provoked? What effect did it have on Salem then and now?
Well, there were rumblings they actually started in the summer of 1692 when, a few brave souls started to question what was happening. I think people were recognizing even during the crisis that things were starting to spin out of control. And there were a couple of very stinging criticisms published in the 1690s, a couple of which we have towards the end of the exhibition there. And the first pardons were issued by the state in 1703. But it's taken a really long time for the community to deal with the repercussions of the crisis. It took 300 years for a memorial to be built here. And the process of exonerating all of those who were accused was completed only in 2001. It's less than 20 years ago.
Wow. Yeah.
So, it takes a long time to come to terms with and reconcile with the past. And I think in some ways we're still wrestling with these issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, also along those lines of taking a long time to fully digest the past and deal with it, I was also interested to find out that among the regular visitors to Salem in general, and in particular to the Salem Witch Museum, are descendants of the victims. And so I was curious, have any descendants been in touch with Peabody Essex Museum about this exhibit? And if so, what kind of questions do they ask about it?
Descendants are in touch with PEM and the library on a fairly regular basis. In fact, there are, it's interesting to note that there are tens of thousands of them.
Wow.
Descendants, there are quite a lot. Even say Richard Trask is himself a descendant of Rebecca Nurse. Mostly folks are looking for further information about their ancestors. They're looking to be pointed at documents that refer to them from the trials.
Yeah.
They might want additional geographical or genealogical or biographical information, that sort of thing, which is something that we, help people out with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, and I'm guessing there would probably be something about just wanting to come to terms with something about seeing the place where things happen or the documents, just to be able to fathom, I would think, what happened to your ancestor. It's fascinating to me to learn that there are that many ancestors, because this was 25 people, but over 300 years, that's a lot of time for different generations. So,
that's right.
So it must be very meaningful. I can only imagine meaningful to them and emotional for them to come to the exhibit and to learn more about what actually happened and to actually see some of these documents that had such an impact on their ancestors' lives.
Yes, and we actually, in one section of the exhibition, we point to another 6 sites that are in the area that people can visit if they want to learn more, if they want to continue their journey. Right. So there's a lot to enjoy in the area.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I know that you had said, and I want to ask you, you mentioned that you wanted to be sure to include a quotation from the exhibit that the exhibit closes with. And it was from, I believe, a winning proposal for the Salem Memorial. So before I let you go today, I'm hoping that you would, in fact, share that quotation with us as well.
Sure, I'd be pleased to. This is a quote from the proposal submitted by James Cutler and Maggie Smith, an architect and an artist, respectively, both from the northwestern United States. That was, in the end, the winning proposal for the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, which is on Charter Street in Salem, right behind the museum. And this quote this is on the last wall that people see when they exit the exhibition. And these ideas are ones that we want people to take with them as they go, and to really drive home the point that we're still seeing injustice and prejudice, and hopefully people will be willing to stand up and speak out when they see it. So that quote reads, Deafness to the voices of others is the root of injustice. Silence in the presence of injustice is complicity.
Mm.
Persecution for invented crimes is a symptom of injustice. And memory of those taken by past injustice should remain with us to guide us in the future.
Powerful and worthy words, in a fitting way to close out one's visit to this exhibit, Dan. So, so how long will the exhibit be on display at the museum, and how can people get more information? And in these COVID times, of course, people have to sign up ahead of time for their tickets. So just tell people a little bit about how they can get information and tickets, and when is the best time for people to plan on going? And I'm guessing not October in Salem.
Right, not October.
Not October.
Yeah, right. So the exhibition is on through April 4th, 2021. So you've got another little less than 6 months to enjoy it. You can see our website, pem.org, PEM.org, for more information. There are time tickets are required, and so you get a general admission time ticket to the museum. And then once you get in the door, there's a time ticket for the specific exhibition as well. So there's kind of a double time ticket system in place. And I recommend that people not come to Salem in October. The mayor is recently, it's a kind of a crazy town in October, and the mayor has actually just released a number of access restrictions to be put in place for the remainder of the month. So I advise people to come in November and December and January and February and March.
Absolutely. So, well, Dan, I said that would be my final question, but there's one more question before I let you go, and we bring Patricia Fay-Ho out to talk about Voices Against Injustice. What is the upcoming exhibit, my dear Davy and Chester, about? I'm intrigued. What is that about? That will open in November, I take it.
It will open at the end of November, actually on Black Friday.
Okay.
And that is a component. It's a component of the South Asian galleries that are the permanent collection South Asian and Indian art galleries that are opening at the same time. And this particular exhibition is in the Phillips Library Collection Gallery, which is a dedicated space for us in the library to have changing exhibitions. And it is we along with the gift of Indian art that Chester and Davida Hurwitz gave to the museum in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which was a world-class collection of modern and contemporary Indian art.
Okay.
It came along with a library of 6,000 books and an archive of correspondence between the Davies and these artists. And so we're pulling out some of the illustrated correspondence between the artists and the Davies to help show how these Indian artists helped the Davies build their collection, establish their network of Indian artists, and show some really fun drawings too.
Okay, so more to look forward to. Well, thank you so much, Dan. It's just been fascinating to learn from you about this exhibit and about the real true history behind it. So thank you so much for visiting the morning show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Mary. Thanks a lot for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, you take care now. Thanks so much.
Bye.
So let's see if we can bring Patricia Fay-Ho on screen now. She is active on the board of Voices Against Injustice, and she's also board president of the House of Seven Gables Settlement Association. So let's see if there she is. Hello, Patricia.
Now, you hear me? Good morning, Mary. A pleasure.
Good morning. Thank you so much for coming to visit the morning show and for talking to us about Voices Against Injustice, which is very much tied to what Dan Lipcan and I were just talking about, the history of the Salem Witch Trials in Salem. So, Patricia, could you start by telling me when, how, and why Voices Against Injustice was founded?
Absolutely. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to connect with Dan's presentation and the work of Voices Against Injustice and our mission. We have to recognize that there is value to history. History is valuable not only to ourselves as individuals, to our communities, and also to our future. And it's because of that that the Salem Award Foundation was founded in 1692, and that was the 300th anniversary of the Salem Witch Trials. This was a sparkling and insightful, inspired endeavor by a group of Salem leaders and citizens with strong support from the city of Salem, Salem State University, and Peabody Essex Museum.
Yeah.
And they established what was to become the 3 parts of our mission. And we remember that through remember, honor, act. Remember is has to do with the stewardship, the creation, dedication, and stewardship of the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, right in the heart of Salem.
Right.
And have you visited, Mary?
I have not, but I certainly am going to.
You know what? So you let me know when you want to visit.
All right.
I will come and take you around, and it is a place of reflection and quiet. It is a site that is not connected with any incident, but it memorializes the whole witch trial, injustices, and remembers the victims. So there are 20 stone benches. This was architect inspired and dedicated by Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, who said that memory is a step toward reconciliation. And so remember is through our stewardship of the memorial so that people come and understand and take away the lessons. Another part is to honor, and that would be to honor through the Salem Award for Human Rights and Civil Rights and Civil and Human Rights. I'm sorry. So to honor these individuals, these champions, these organizations who have spoken up and acted out against injustices in all forms, to act against all forms of oppression through their courage and through their action. And this has really been across the whole spectrum of human rights and social justice. So civil rights, we have honored since 1992, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Physicians for Human Rights, Leonard Zakim and the Anti-Defamation League, immigration advocacy rights, labor leaders, global rights in Afghanistan, Sudan, and Africa, HIV/AIDS advocates, and most recently, the Center for Popular Democracy in speaking out for women's rights and the right of citizens to speak out, and also the Ground Truth Project, which has to do with grassroots truthful journalism. And the other part, so remember, honor, act would be taking what we've learned from all of the injustices that we have seen in history and translating them, seeing parallels in what is happening today, and encouraging our citizens to speak up, to find their voices, either working individually or collectively. And we have seen that today. So I know you and I want to have a conversation about those parallels and the lessons of the witch trials.
Yes, absolutely. But thank you for that. I mean, I am so struck by the idea of memory being the link to reconciliation, because of what the antithesis of that would be then is that denial is the refusal to reconcile. Forgetting is the antithesis of reconciliation. So that seems like, it certainly underscores your message about the importance of history, because history is what enables us to remember in an informed way and in an accurate way. And without it, then we would not be able to transform and move forward. And all the groups that you mentioned having honored in the past are certainly major transformative agents of change in the positive direction of greater social justice for everyone. So thank you for that. That's sounds like your organization has a really significant and transformative mandate. So
Well,
let's talk. Oh, go ahead.
could I mention one more thing?
Of course.
We have our nominations open until November 1st. And if you go onto our website, voicesagainst.injustice.org, you will see the nomination form, which can be submitted online or by mail, and you can contact us through our website.
Good to know. Good to know. Well, Patricia, I know this is a big question, but I'm going to ask it of you anyway, because I'm pretty confident you'll have an answer. So, what are the lessons, the most important lessons from the 1692 witch trials and all the things that Dan Lipcan was just so eloquently teaching us about? Which lessons does Voices Against Injustice most want to make sure that we hang on to and never forget and apply in our current lives?
Well, in 1692, fear overtook courage.
Oh,
and
I knew you'd have an answer.
Oh,
well put.
Prejudice overcame
truth
and reason. And so you see that there were extreme weather conditions, socioeconomic change, great upheaval, great stress, illness among the people. And the parallels today are, we have climate change, we have a pandemic that people are dying from and really stressed about, and the loneliness, the social isolation. We see the discrimination against others, people who are considered outside, just as in 1692, the marginalized individuals were singled out. And so now we look at the plight of immigrants, of LGBTQ, of people of color, of people who are marginalized because of income inequality. There are so many different factions and divisions, which is what happened in 1692. Divisions within our country according to political, economic, social, racial, everything, which goes to the very heart of our society. And I think indeed in 1692, it was not only the church, but the government that were nearly torn asunder because there were so many conflicts and so many ways that people were acting out of mistrust, intolerance, fear. And we see that today. But I saw your interview with Joe regarding conspiracy theories. And so you think about it, because there was a reliance on spectral evidence.
Yeah, that's a good phrase. Spectral evidence is very relevant to today's times.
It's what appeared to somebody, but not verified.
Right.
And so we have the belief and the increasing adherence to theories like QAnon.
Yes, right.
And there are many different conspiracies. And, that tears apart the belief in society, the trust in others, the belief in what your government is trying to do. It tears at the very heart of your well-being. And so what we need to do is to have the courage, and we're seeing that. There are courageous people and organizations who are speaking out. And I see the environmental groups very definitely. I see people who are working in criminal justice, people in the healthcare, in the banking industries, in housing, all trying to right those injustices.
Yeah. And it's important for us to turn away from the chaos regularly and take note of the work that those people are doing, and that people like you and Voices Against Injustice are doing. So I knew you'd have a good answer for that question about the relevance. And I love the phrase spectral evidence. Thank you for that. Who is this year's winner of the award, by the way? Because I think it's a different group, isn't it, than the ones
Yes,
you've already
it is the
mentioned? So would you like to tell us about this year's winner?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It is the Massachusetts Bail Fund.
Yeah.
And when we recognized the Massachusetts Bail Fund, they were awarding cash bail of $500 to individuals who were accused but not yet not yet convicted, not yet tried. And so without the $500 or whatever amount, they would have been kept in jail,
Yeah.
away from their families, away from their jobs. It's almost like in 1692 and in debtors' prisons, the accused were kept in jail and in fact made to pay for their own keep. But getting back to the Mass Bail Fund, their whole mission is to reform the criminal justice cash bail system and how people are held with no consideration of the inherent inequity. Because if you had the means and you could pay your bail, you could go free. Whereas if you had not, then you were separated and you were then exposed to the violence and now the COVID situation.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And yes, especially in a justice system that frames itself as based upon innocent until proven guilty, it seems all the more ironic that we haven't addressed those inequities before. And it's wonderful that you're acknowledging people who have taken action on it.
We realize that has become a controversial issue because following George Floyd's tragic murder, there was an inpouring of donations to groups like the Mass Bail Fund, and they became more flush with cash so that they were awarding higher bails. And I think there was one incident, and we'll talk about it, one or several incidents in which those individuals went on to commit other crimes. But that is not the fault of the intent of the mission, which is to consider, as you said, innocence until proven guilty, and giving everybody that equitable level of being able to contest. And so what we're doing is, because we are a group of reflection and civil discourse, we are going to present a panel discussion with many different perspectives around aspects of the criminal justice system and the cash bail system. And that will be in November, to which we will invite whoever wishes to attend. And this is for a look at both an empathetical view and also not, to look at all the different perspectives, to try to understand why people have differences of opinions and why ramifications can sometimes be very bad or ugly.
Yeah. Well, in there you use the phrase civil discourse, which is also something we hope will expand its influence on all of us. And it sounds like a wonderful idea to have that kind of open discussion from all different angles. Well, Patricia, it sounds like a wonderful organization and really important work. How can people learn more about Voices Against Injustice?
Thank you for asking. Well, go to our website, voicesagainst.injustice.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, but go to our website because there is a direct way of contacting us, and we are always seeking a diverse group of leaders and community members. And we're not just based in Salem. We have people from around the North Shore and beyond. And so we're looking for committee members, board members, and volunteers, because we are strictly a volunteer organization, no executive director, and we fundraise for the Salem Award and for our operating expenses. So donations are also welcome.
You bet. And lots of opportunities to volunteer and participate in this terrific organization. Patricia, thank you so much for visiting the morning show and for teaching us about voices in justice and for making such an impassioned and articulate link between Salem Witch Trials 1692 and the present. I really appreciate your coming on the show.
And
Thank you so
come and
much.
visit. Let me
I'll
know.
let you know. I absolutely will. Thank you so much, Patricia. I really appreciate it. That's it for today's show, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll join us next Thursday on the morning show, again, Thursday at 9 a.m. If you miss any part of today's show, you can find it available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at www.ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday morning at 8 a.m. and the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. as well as Wednesday at 3 p.m. It'll also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just click on the cloud icon at www.ncmhub.org and then scroll down. Also for music lovers, WJOP FM 96.3 has a new show for you to try. The World of Jazz is a 2-hour radio show containing a variety of jazz music, and it's hosted by Newburyport resident Sean Gogan. In between sets, Sean will talk about the history of jazz music and its evolution since the 1910s in New Orleans. So catch the World of Jazz new every Saturday from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And it also will repeat every Monday from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., Thursday from 8 to 10 p.m. and Friday from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. You can also find each broadcast on the SoundCloud as well. Visit ncmhub.org and click on the cloud, then scroll down. That's it for today, everybody. Farewell. See you next Thursday.